if we don't put this fire out in Ukraine, what we'll see is Putin expanding his sphere of influence, which he clearly wants to do in the Slavic area of Europe, and that will eventually bump into NATO. And that's where we could be ending up, where this could escalate.
Welcome now to the programme, Tobias Ellwood, the Conservative Chair of the Defence Select Committee at Westminster. Tobias, welcome.
Good evening to you.
It's good to have you with us, Tobias. We're all keen to talk to you. George.
Yes, Tobias, we've had this refresh, so-called, of the original integrated review, the sort of blueprint for government foreign and defence policy. Do you think the first version of it got it wrong? I was just looking at the remarks by David Lammy, Labour's spokesman in the Commons today, saying it didn't foresee the Taliban taking over Kabul, didn't foresee the risk of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, didn't mention risks to Taiwan, didn't mention the European Union. Do you think it was a bit of a duff paper in the first place?
Yeah, you can't predict what's going to come over the horizon, but you must have the versatility, the flexibility to be able to meet the potential threats that you're likely to face. And what we saw in the last integrated review, March 2021, was a huge tilt towards investing in cyber and space security. These were the new arenas of vulnerability in our ever complex, sort of technologically driven world. And surely that's going to be the face of battles to come. And so the defense budget was essentially frozen, I'm afraid. There was no further money for those two areas, and that could only be achieved by spending into cyber and space with swathing cuts to our land, sea, and air assets. So we saw reductions in tank, fighting vehicle, fast jet, rotary, even heavy lift capabilities. They were all cut out, along with, of course, with the Army's headcount of 10,000. And that's why there's an awful lot of people looking at the armed forces, including myself, and saying the Army especially has been hollowed out and is not really fit for purpose with the threats that are coming over the horizon. So Ukraine provided that massive wake-up call. Oh my goodness, we've got it wrong. Let's have another integrated review. We'll call it the refresh. But I have to say it has been disappointing in the sense that 5 billion sounds an awful lot of money, but 2/3 of that is going towards the nuclear deterrent and AUKUS and so forth, and 1/3 is going to replenish the stocks of ammunition that we've been spending. There is nothing there to advance the defense posture of our Army, Air Force, or Navy, which are simply too small to conduct the current responsibilities and duties they have, let alone what is coming over the hill.
And Tobias, on that point about funding, because you're right, I mean, the government is hailing this £5 billion investment today as more money for the military, but there are people who are criticising it and saying that a huge amount is going to be spent on nuclear, leaving the military actually behind. So they will have to cut things back because they don't have enough money to stand still. I suppose the point that lots of people would make is that we are unlikely to fight a war needing lots of tanks and helicopters, that may not be how the next war is fought if we are involved in it, and that actually the investment should be put into different capabilities. And maybe even, nuclear defence is one of those, the argument goes. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, let's just start from the top, because whenever you do a defense review, the first thing to do is to say what is the threat picture. And there's one paragraph in the integrated review refresh, which is just worth reading out. There is a growing prospect that the international security environment will further deteriorate in the next coming years, with state threats increasing and diversifying in Europe and beyond. The risk of escalation is greater than at any time in decades. Now, if that wasn't a statement to say that our peacetime defense budget needs to be improved and we need to start moving to a war footing, I don't know what is. And the fact that we just, focusing on nuclear and on replenishing the cupboards of the weapons that we've used is simply not enough. We want to play that role on the international stage. And you can argue that there are certain systems, rotary platforms or otherwise. But ultimately, it's not about just fighting a peer-to-peer war that we might be doing. It's also about keeping the peace. It's about protecting our sea lanes. It's about opening up our corridors that globalization has created that actually feeds our economy. Take Odessa, for example. The fact that only 1/5 of the grain can't get out is affecting inflation here in this country. So we fix that, which we could do if we really wanted to, that impacts on our economy, our prosperity here. But we're not able to deal with the challenges of Ukraine, let alone with what's coming over the hill. And 2023 will be a determining year as we see Russia and China exploit and pursue a very different interpretation of our international rules-based order. We're on the foothills of a new Cold War. We're simply not investing enough in our armed forces.
Tobias, you mentioned we should be on a war footing, and then I think you mentioned the possibility of a peer-to-peer war. Can you just explain to people what you mean by that? Who might we be fighting a war against?
Well, the two biggest adversaries are going to be, Russia and China. Now, neither have been tested against us, but Russia has been tested and found wanting in Ukraine. But what they have on their side is their ability to endure hardship. They can throw a lot of people at this. Putin can keep going and hope that the Western patience will dry up. That's what he's hoping to achieve now.
But
And
Tobias, sorry to cut in there, are you suggesting that the UK would fight a land war against Russia or potentially China? Is that what you're saying?
so I'm saying that if we don't put this fire out in Ukraine, what we'll see is Putin expanding his sphere of influence, which he clearly wants to do in the Slavic area of Europe, and that will eventually bump into NATO, and that's where we could be ending up, where this could escalate. So
Okay,
it's in
Tobias, let me just
interests.
zero in on that point. I remember, by the way, you having a head-to-head with then Prime Minister Boris Johnson over the value of tanks to the British military. He spoke of tanks as if they were muskets, and now we know from the experience of Ukraine that a tank is not a musket. It's actually a very important piece of military equipment. But equally, Tobias, when we talk about, or you talk about peer fighting, given the way Russia has been so bruised trying to take its neighbour, Ukraine, is it realistic to see a threat to NATO territory of a kind that would invoke Article 5, an attack on one, an attack on all, and that kind of warfare now? Is that not now more remote than it was?
No, not at all. This is, again, we're not understanding where Putin wants to go in the longer term. They're developing a symbiotic relationship. It's not quite equal, but Russia and China, as I say, are pursuing a very different interpretation of the international rules-based order and encouraging others to join with them. So authoritarianism is now on the rise. The West is actually getting smaller, and we've forgotten the art of statecraft that we had during the Cold War to stand up and challenge what's going on. NATO is the most formidable military alliance in the world, and yet it's essentially benched in order to, enable to stand up and support Ukraine in the way that it should. So this is now dragging on. And don't forget, turning to China, is watching our precedents, everything that we do, what we're doing, the protocols that we now follow, the standards that we actually apply. And they'll be looking very carefully to see we've not increased our defense budget. We're heading towards a Cold War. Last one, we spent 4% GDP on defense. We're not even moving here. We're turning a little bit on nuclear. Of course, we're going to do that. And we're replenishing our stocks. But actually, our army is not going to change in size.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.